We're going to have our last panel for today on socio-religious inclusion. We have three panelists, Nathan Brown, Miriam Künkler, and Amel Bubeker. I'm going to introduce Nathan first, and then we're going to go in the order that's listed in the program, and then we'll continue an introduction with after Nathan. So Nathan Brown is currently a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University in DC. He is the director of Institute for Middle East at the Elliott School for International Affairs. He is a distinguished scholar and author of 6 well-received books on Middle Eastern politics. I may be wrong, but his most recent book is When Victory is Not an Option. Okay. That's the second most recent one, but still a very good book from Oxford. I personally benefited a lot from reading Nathan's books, and I continue reading as I work on my new book manuscript on Islamist parties. I found a lot of stuff from the book you co-authored with Amr, talking about various Islamist groups and how, especially in terms of their organizational structures and such, that's really helpful to me. Nathan's expertise spans religion, law, and politics in the Arab world. In addition to his academic work, Brown serves on the MENA Advisory Committee for Human Rights Watch. He is the former president of Middle Eastern Studies Association. He is a former Guggenheim Fellow and a Carnegie Scholar. And I think I'll stop here. We could probably go on and on, but I think that should suffice. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much, Qadir. Yeah, since the book on a Muslim Brother as a political party, I've been working a little bit on Islam and public life in the Arab world, and I've taken a particular interest in the construction of religion-state relations, or that is how it is that the essentially states in the Arab world. States in the Arab world sort of construct the religious sector. And that's what my paper here is going to focus on. When I look at the Arab world, I began actually, before I worked on religious structures, with legal structures, and I found the Arab states often tend to be fairly homologous. If you go to one Arab state and you have a few structures in mind, you can often find them in the legal and religious realms. But there are a few states that stick out, and one of the ones that looks just completely unlike the other in structural terms in the religious realm is Saudi Arabia. It has institutions like the religious police. It has no easy equivalent anywhere else in the Arab world. What in the rest of the Arab world are referred to sometimes as Sharia courts remain courts of general jurisdiction in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has resisted up to this day codification of law. So my question is that I want to ask us is sort of why? Why is this different? And the argument that I'm going to make is that it has to do an awful lot with the pattern of state formation, that often when Saudi Arabia's structure and behavior in the religious realm are explained in terms of, sort of in doctrinal terms, in terms of Wahhabi Islam, but I'm going to argue instead it has an awful lot to do with historical pattern of state formation. Now, you might ask, and Qadir was too kind to ask in his introduction, what does this have to do with building pluralistic and inclusive states post-Arab Spring? He was too polite to ask in the introduction, but he's asked me a couple times in email messages, and I kept promising you'll have your answer in Beirut. And so one of the things I'll try to do is to answer that question. The other thing that Qadir said after he saw a draft of my paper, he says it's very, very good, but, and anytime you hear it's very, very good, but, you know that it's very, very good was actually meant there's something wrong with it.
No, there's nothing wrong with it.
Okay.
It was good.
But he's too polite, yes, as you see. But he said it's too long, and my first reaction was I felt kind of like Mozart when he was told by Emperor Joseph II, that the marriage of Figaro was good, but it had too many notes. I said, but it needs all these details. It needs all these footnotes. But so as a result, I'm going to try and not only answer Qadir's question about what does this have to do with pluralism and inclusion, and what does it have to do with the post-2011 environment, but I'm also going to try and make it shorter. And in order to make it shorter, I'm going to basically take out all the interesting details and talk at a greater level of generality than is probably warranted by my research. But so what I'm I'm going to try and do is boil down my remarks to 4 claims. Number one, something having to do with the history of state formation producing different kinds of religious structures as part of the state. Second, I'm going to take a look at 2 specific kinds of religious structures, actually the ones I just mentioned, the religious police and the courts in Saudi Arabia, and try and see how they operate as a result of this distinctive pattern of state formation. Third, I'm finally going to get to the inclusion issue and argue essentially that the pattern in Saudi Arabia in a sense created some kind of religious constituency, even almost a religious public, but folded it inside the state apparatus in a way that was distinctive. And fourth, I will say post-2011, and this is where I will get relevant to the present day. There's many changes in Saudi Arabia, but one of them is essentially converging back to the norm. And this will be driven essentially by a comparison between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. So let me begin with the first part of the argument, that there's something having to do with essentially the historical pattern of state formation. When I compare Egypt and Saudi Arabia, there are and especially when it comes to religious structures, there's 2 big differences that I think produce an awful lot of the different structural outcomes. Number one, the Ottoman heritage. When you look at the way the Egyptian state was built, especially in the 19th century, and you can trace an awful lot of structures in their current form back to the 19th century, there are ways in which the Ottoman heritage had direct influence, because Egypt was still technically an Ottoman province, so it was sometimes governed or reflected what Ottoman practice was, and sometimes a reaction against Ottoman practice. There's this odd feature, for instance, today in Egypt, that all death sentences have to be approved by the Mufti before they're carried out. Why is this? It basically has to do with late 19th century Ottoman-Egyptian relations and the decision by by Egypt in order to assert some autonomy from the Ottoman Empire of building a new institution, essentially, which is now Darul Ifta in Egypt, headed by an official Mufti who was going to play the same institutional role and legal role that the Sheikh al-Islam played for the Ottoman Empire. So it's basically sort of trying to transpose Ottoman structures and Egyptianize them. Saudi Arabia, by contrast, the Ottomans were present in parts of the Arabian Peninsula, but when Saudi state formation basically began in the 20s and especially the 1930s and 1940s, it did not build on any kind of Ottoman basis. So some of the big difference in outcomes has to do with Ottoman heritage, and a second big experience is imperialism. And one of the effects of imperialism throughout much of the Arab world was essentially to wall off religious structures from other kinds of state structures. So you have separate court systems, sometimes separate educational systems that develop, and sometimes this has to do with the period before direct imperial rule. Sometimes it's a reaction against imperial rule, in other words, to wall off religious structures from imperial powers, and sometimes imperial powers themselves essentially come in and they essentially create the category of personal status law, which did not exist as a distinct category of law in classical Islamic jurisprudence. And again, Saudi Arabia does not have a direct imperial experience in that same way. The result is that state formation, even when you have similar kinds of areas being covered, religion and law and so on, takes a very different road in Saudi Arabia. So let me turn to the 2 structures I talked about, the religious police and the courts. The religious police are, of course, based on the idea of hisba, which essentially would be some kind of policing of public morality by state officials. There's no doctrinal rejection of the idea in Egypt at all. It survives in weird sort of institutional places. For a long time, guardianship courts were called hisbi courts in Egypt because of this. There was a muhtasib who basically peters out in influence during the period of Ottoman rule. But the doctrine lived on today. Until fairly recently, individual Egyptian citizens could launch hisba suits in Egyptian state courts. After the Nasr Hamad Abu Zaid case in the 1990s, that was taken away so that citizen complaints, hisba complaints, go to the public prosecutor, who then decides whether or not to file them. And of course, Al-Azhar has a censorship ability, which was affirmed and in a sense strengthened by the administrative courts, in a sense secular courts, also within a recent decade. So there's some ways in which the Egyptian state certainly plays a role in public morality, but the institutional and legal expressions of that are a product of Egyptian history and Egyptian state formation. In Saudi Arabia, by contrast, you have this large public body, and it is one that has plays an enormous role in Saudi public life. It is one that is an independent agency, essentially, an independent body for commanding good and preventing evil, and it is attached independently to the cabinet. And it, until fairly recently, I'll get to that, actually had significant kind of policing powers. So that's one way in which they kind of form differently. So the doctrine of Hisba just expresses itself in very different institutional forms because of the way that the states were built. Second, with courts, again, there was no period in which you have, so the codification of law was done in Egypt basically from the 1870s with the mixed courts and the 1880s with national courts that had jurisdiction over Egyptians. The creation of sort of a hierarchical court system on the French civil law model was something that was done again in the same period. And as part of that, you had you had the older court system, what came to be called the Sharia court system, or for non-Muslims, what in Egypt they call the Milli court system, that operated outside of that until they were finally folded into the regular court system in 1955. So the courts of general jurisdiction were ones that were essentially civil law courts, both in their structure and their law. And that's been the case since the 19th century. And you had other areas of law and other areas of courts kind of carved out. In Saudi Arabia, you had the exact opposite process. When you had, for instance, commercial courts or labor courts that were built up, those were carved out of the regular court system, and jurisdiction was transferred over to them. But what in the rest of the Arab world would have been called Sharia courts remain to this day the courts of general jurisdiction. And codification of law, that is sitting down and actually writing down what the law is, was something that the judiciary has resisted in Saudi Arabia, and they had the political power in order to do so. There's no doctrinal difference between Azhari Islam and Hanbali or Wahhabi Islam on the matter of codification, but the Saudi judiciary was powerful enough and it regarded codification as something that would disrupt its ability to discern the proper Sharia-based ruling. And it's not accidental. If you talk to some Saudi judges even today, you'll hear this attitude that says, we're not really state judges. A court is like a mosque. It's a zone for that operates independently of the ruler. Okay, so now let me get on to answering Kadir's question. What does this have to do with inclusion? Well, I think the overall result was that in Egypt you had a religious sector that was far more bureaucratized and far more hierarchical and far more under control of the rulers than existed in Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, by contrast, these zones that I'm talking about were ones that were state zones, but as I just referred to the judiciary, also ones that jealously guarded their autonomy and that tended to draw on specific parts of the society. They tended to draw on specific regions, they tended to draw on specific sectors and even sometimes families within those regions. The judiciary, for instance, was hired, there would be specific towns that were famous for producing judges, and specific universities and Sharia faculties that were more prestigious than others, and so you had this, in essence, kind of this part of the Saudi society that saw itself as serving and constituting almost a religious sector, and so you had essentially, as opposed to Egypt, a far more autonomous religious realm, one that played a more powerful role within the state, and that operated with some autonomy from it. So, in a sense, what you had, it's not surprising, therefore, that when religious publics begin to emerge in Egypt, they often emerge outside of the state apparatus in ways that could even take on an oppositional tone. Obviously, most prominently the case with the Muslim Brotherhood, but in other ways as well. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, those were folded much more into the state apparatus. the religious public, such as it was, such as it existed, was part of the state apparatus. Now, finally, let me turn this to the situation post-2011. What I argue is going on is a little bit of convergence. There's some convergence of Egypt slightly towards the Saudi model, but in the interest of time, I won't go into that. But what is happening in Saudi Arabia, I mean, there's all kinds of dramatic changes. I don't focus on the dramatic changes, however, in my paper. I focus on the really boring ones. And some of the really boring ones are, for instance, that the religious police have been, they've got this wonderful website that includes all their regulations and all their hierarchy and so on. One regulation that was recently changed, this was about a year and a half ago, says if they see an offense, it used to be that they could arrest a person directly, now they report the offense to the police. And in essence, what they've done is been robbed of their policing power. So the Committee to Command Virtue and Prevent Vice no longer prevents vice, it just commands virtue. And essentially, it's a committee to nag Saudis to do the right thing, but they can't do anything about it if they don't. Another technical change that is now in the works, but is not necessarily, there's a draft legislation that would allow graduates of law faculties to serve in the judiciary, in addition to Sharia faculties. This would be an earth-shattering move, essentially. It's all kinds of other ways. If you look at which Saudi universities offer degrees in Sharia and in law, they've greatly expanded. So this monopoly of a specific sector of Saudi society over the religious sector is being shattered, and there's talk, for instance, of folding the religious police from being an independent agency to being part of the Ministry of Interior or part of the Ministry of Religious Affairs, essentially bureaucratically subordinating them. And so what is happening in essence it's happening in all areas of Saudi politics and Saudi life. That's great centralization. But the effect for the religious sector, I think, will be to replicate something that looks a little bit closer to the Egyptian model, where you have a regime that can micromanage the religious sector and can exercise much greater control over it. And the effect could easily be, and this is speculative, but this sort of part of Saudi society that would look at the Saudi state and look at the religious sector and say, that's us, that is our role, is going to be excluded from that. There's all kinds of reasons. If you want to do certain things in Saudi Arabia, you might be happy about that. But the political effect of that could actually, I think, create in a later generation or in a later decade a kind of bifurcation that has never existed in Saudi society, and a much stronger opposition from some of the religious sector to the structure of the Saudi state. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. That was great. And now we have Miriam. So Miriam Künkler is a professor at the Universität Göttingen's Institute of Advanced Study. She specializes in comparative relations between religions and the state, particularly in Iran and Indonesia. Her work examines the interplay of religion and state regarding political parties, questions of law and constitutionalism, religious education, Islamic authority, and the legal system. She has published with Cambridge and Oxford University presses. Her recent work focuses on female religious authority in Islam and, I hope I get this right, but also role of religion in democratic backslide. Backslide, is that right? Yeah, okay.
Thank you so much. I apologize for my voice. I have a bad cold, and if you can't hear me, then please just give me a sign. So I will talk about recent initiatives in the region to promote female religious authority, and it's quite an unusual topic, I think. Not many people are working on this, and I will tell you in a moment how I got to it. But first, as a sort of overview, so the Carnegie Project focuses on various strategies of building societies in the Middle East that value and defend pluralism and diversity, a task that will likely involve the transformation of all areas and levels of society, from professional associations to businesses, the public sector, and the private family. The field of religious authority, whether in Islam, in most sects of Christianity, or Judaism, is still by and large a field that lacks gender diversity. Rarely are women accepted as interpreters of religious law, as prayer leaders in front of mixed congregations, or as religious leaders whose advice is sought beyond questions pertaining to the home, child rearing, or typical women's issues. But the field is slowly changing and has been for the better part of a decade now, as several states in the Middle East have begun to train women as religious authorities. The Waiselada of Turkey come to mind, as do the Murshidat of Morocco, the thousands of female students in Iran's Shiite seminaries, and the female Islamic scholars of Al-Azhar who push the boundaries of gender segregation in prayer. And I just want to tell you a little bit about how I came to this topic. I read many years ago a book by Michael Cook, my colleague at that time in Princeton, about Quranic interpretation. And he mentioned just in a side note on sort of a chapter on tafsir, he just mentioned in one sentence that there was this Iranian woman called Banu Isfahani, meaning the woman from Isfahan, who had authored an entire tafsir. And since I work on Iran, I thought this is very interesting. I hadn't really heard of her, and I also hadn't heard of women interpreting the Quran, writing an entire tafsir, right, on every single Quranic surah. And I went to him and I asked him, this is fascinating that you mentioned Banu Isfahani, and can you tell me more about her and her tafsir? And he said, well, actually, I can't tell you anything because everything I know about her is included in this one sentence. All I know is that she authored this tafsir. And I wanted to mention it because I also had never heard of a woman authoring an entire Quranic commentary. So it happened that her commentary was available in the Princeton Library, and it's a work of 15 volumes in Persian, and I was just ecstatic to find it. There were only 3 libraries in the United States that have it, and then maybe 1 or 2 in Europe, and then of course in Iran you have several libraries that contain a tafsir. But of course it was published in the early 80s, and I took it out of the library and opened it, and I realized there wasn't a single stamp in this tafsir, so nobody had ever bothered to take this out from the library, and there really is a lot of scholarship at Princeton about Quranic commentary and also at other universities. So you really wonder, how is it possible that there's this one woman who wrote a Quranic commentary and nobody ever checked out her tafsir? So then, fortunately, I found a student, a PhD student, who's now writing her dissertation about that tafsir. And the next time after I found out about Nusrat Amin, I went to Iran and to Isfahan, spent some time there where she had her seminary, because she actually built 2 seminaries at a time when the Shah, introduced secular education and especially co-educational education. She sort of went against the trend by opening Shiite seminaries only for girls. So you have religious education here and also gender-segregated education, going against both state trends at the time. She really is somebody who created a field in Iran for the training of women in religious studies, which, as I will tell you in a moment, has changed quite a bit since she did so, but I would consider her a foundational figure. So she died in 1986, and her school does not exist anymore today, but you have hundreds of schools in Iran today only for women studying in the Shiite seminaries. So in my paper, I give a little bit of an overview of some of these recent state initiatives to train women in religious studies, and I will close with talking about Iran. I obviously cannot talk about all the different sort of case studies here from the paper, but they will all be published as part of the project publication at some point. So although numerous historical examples attest to women serving as interpreters of Islamic law, as jurists of Islamic law, as transmitters of hadith, and scholars of Islam, the 20th century has seen various legal and educational barriers for women who seek to acquire Islamic religious authority on par with men. There are very few countries today where women are accepted as Islamic preachers, are eligible to serve as judges in Islamic courts, or exercise religious authority in other ways with a degree of influence comparable to that of their male counterparts. Notably, the contemporary situation is often more restrictive to female religious authority than the schools of law the madahib allow for. I just want to emphasize this. The situation is more restrictive than the madahib allow for. Historically, the majority opinions in all Sunni schools of law permitted women to be muftis in all matters, on any question. So not just typical women's issues, gender issues, hygiene, issues of sort of home economics, on any issues. The majority opinions in all Sunni schools of law permitted women to be muftis in all matters. In Twelver Shi'ism, minority opinions held that women could become mujtahidas, so those who are trained sufficiently to apply independent reasoning, ijtihad, to legal reasoning. And in the 19th and 20th century, in Iran, we do indeed come across references to individual women who are referred to as mujtahidas. No woman, however, has ever been recognized as a marja, as a source of emulation, the highest rank of Shia religious authority, and most jurists hold that women cannot exercise this privilege. The past decade has witnessed some consequential changes in regard to female Islamic authority. In several Muslim-majority societies, institutional and legal frameworks have been reformed to allow for the training and certification of women as preachers, as vice muftis, as advisory judges in courts applying Islamic law, or even as judges. In some countries, these developments are state-driven. In others, such initiatives have emanated from society. In 2006, the Moroccan state began to train female religious counselors, so-called murshidat, to be assigned to mosques around the country with the task of responding to religious inquiries. The main role of these counselors is to provide legal guidance to women so that female believers are not compelled to consult men on health and women-specific issues. The Murshidat program is administered by Morocco's Ministry of Habous, of Religious Endowments, and every year the ministry selects between 50 and 100 women from more than 1,000 applicants who undergo a 45-week training course in subject areas including religion, history, geography, Islamic law, and psychology. In contrast to their male counterparts, the murshidat must not give the khutbah, so the sermon, or engage in propagation in front of men. Although after completion of the training program, murshidat are supposed to be assigned alongside their male counterparts to one of Morocco's 40,000 mosques, graduates may also move into other professional areas, and they often function more as social workers than as religious authorities. The Moroccan state has also organized a lecture series in Rabat's largest mosque during the month of Ramadan, to which female Islamic authorities are frequently invited as speakers. In the United Arab Emirates, women serve as religious advisors at the Abu Dhabi Fatwa Center, although they are confined to advising women on women's issues only. In 2010, it was announced that female muftis would be appointed to the Dubai Fatwa Council and that these would be eligible to advise and issue decrees on any religious matter. But to date, there is no confirmation that this has been realized. Ahmed Al-Haddad, the Grand Mufti of Dubai, who also heads the State Department of Islamic Affairs and Charitable Activities, stated, in many Muslim countries, women are already involved with the issuing of fatwas or legal rulings, but frequently these are confined to female issues. However, a woman who is learned and trained in issuing fatwas is not limited in her role to issuing fatwas that relate to women only, but rather she's qualified to issue on matters of worship, jurisprudence, morality, and behavior. So in his interpretation, their authority should be wider. Women that are trained in his institution should be allowed to issue fatwas on any issue. Al-Haddad went on to say that Islamic tradition was rich, quote, rich in examples of highly learned women acting as muftis and issuing decrees on all matters, end of quote. And he added that, beginning of quote, women too can order acts of virtue and ban acts of vice, just like we heard this council in Saudi Arabia does, just like a man can, which is what female contemporaries of the Prophet have done, as well as the women who came after them, end of quote. Al-Haddad indicated further that the situation might be different with regard to the position of a Grand Mufti. Reacting to reports of the controversies on the question at Al-Azhar, he explained, controversy about women mufti does not necessarily arise at the local level, where he wants to introduce it in Dubai, but on the question of whether women should be appointed to a position of state mufti, which is not what we are trying to do here. Okay, so a gradual program of reform. How much more time do I have? Okay, I'll just briefly talk about Turkey and then Iran very briefly. So the Turkish Directorate of Religious Affairs, the Diyanet, has appointed 7 female assistant muftis who may issue fatwas on women's issues. So again here, the confinement to women's issues. But comparatively speaking, the Diyanet has probably been the most proactive promoter of women's authority in the realm of preaching. Since 2006, it has certified more than 300 women as Bayan Vaizlar, that is Diyanet personnel who give lessons at a mosque 3 times a week and may lead pilgrims to Mecca. It has also more recently begun to send female Vaizlar abroad, such as to Turkish mosques in Germany. Currently, there are 13 female Vaizlar in Germany at mosques that are administered by the Foreign Office of the Diyanet, the so-called DTIP-administered mosques. I will summarize what I write about Iran in order to save some time, but Iran is the country that has by far funded women's religious education more than any other Muslim majority state that I'm aware of. There are between 90,000 and 100,000 Hausa students every year, so students in the Shiite seminaries. More than a third of them are women. And what's particularly interesting is that this program was introduced already in the 1980s. Ayatollah Khomeini was quite open to including women in religious education, and he was, as you know, also someone who occasionally actually referred to women as people who had taught him. By the way, the great Ayatollah Burujerdi, the great Marja of the 1960s, his mother was a mujtahida herself, so she was somebody who was an expert in Islamic law. So there was state support in the 1980s to include women in religious training, but very interestingly, under his successor, Ayatollah Khamenei, the most important level in training was cut. So there are 3 levels to the Hausa education, the introductory level, then the second is the Sutu level, and it's only at the 3rd level that you're trained to engage in ijtihad and that you can become a mujtahid, which is really the opening door to then advance further in the hierarchy of religious authority to be accepted as an ayatollah and eventually to be accepted as a source of emulation. So for believers to really accept you as a religious leader, you have to have completed this 3rd cycle, the ijtihad cycle. It's called Dars Kharaj, because you're allowed to sort of challenge your teachers and to go outside of the accepted boundaries of discourse. And this is the cycle that was cut under Ayatollah Khamenei. So you have a situation today, interestingly enough, where Iran trains more women than any other country in these introductory cycles of religious education, but where you don't have the possibility to be trained in the finesses of Islamic law and the intricacies of Islamic law that would allow you to gain the expertise to then reinterpret Islamic law, which is really what the pinnacle of religious authority is about, right? In the end, you want to be able to interpret religious law and to reinterpret it and possibly to challenge dominant discourses, and that's what you're no longer trained to do after this 3rd cycle was cut. So just to close, if I have 2-3 more minutes. Female experts on Islamic legal questions are increasingly being trained either in the context of state-run initiatives such as in Turkey, in Iran, Morocco, or as a result of programs and appointments established by individual male religious authorities, such as in the case of Syria and India, where also muftis are being trained. In India, interestingly enough, not only on women's issues, and in Hyderabad, even men also now consult these muftiyas. I also just want to mention on the side that there's another part of the paper that deals with women judges in courts that apply Islamic law. And some of you may or may not know that the West Bank has appointed 3 women judges, right, over the last 10 years that have sort of made quite a lot of headway and also impacted the demands for the appointment of a women judge in the Sharia courts in Israel, where the first female Sharia court judge was actually appointed last year in 2017. Which in turn has also impacted demands on the Jewish side for the appointment of female Jewish judges in the Jewish courts, which is still a taboo issue. So there are very, very interesting dynamics between these judges in the West Bank, the female Islamic court judge now in Israel, and demands to also appoint women in the Jewish religious courts in Israel. But judging is still a more complicated matter, and I've just talked about muftis here in this part of the presentation. Notwithstanding the limited role some of these freshly certified female ulama enjoy, the expansion of Islamic religious authority to women is remarkable. What motivates states or male religious authorities to create such new opportunities? Why do states embark on such initiatives that carry not only financial but also potential social costs? Secular, quote-unquote, secular rulers such as King Mohammed of Morocco and the Turkish government may be driven by the expectation that increased inclusion of women may improve the regime's legitimacy in the eyes of the public. Moreover, where regimist ulama face legitimacy problems, as was the case in pre-war Syria, the employment of female religious authorities may increase responsiveness between state-sanctioned ulama and the state and give citizens, at least female citizens, who may feel more comfortable consulting with female ulama, a greater sense of trust in religious authorities. In contexts where societies are perceived to be Islamizing, governments may decide to regulate this process as much as possible, which maybe one can say in the case of Egypt, and preempt radicalization trends by expanding the social reach of religious authorities trained in state institutions. Male religious authorities such as the Grand Mufti of Damascus or the Grand Mufti of Hyderabad may hope to reinforce Islam's appeal by extending religious authority to women and may respond directly to pressures from the Ummah to include women among their students. There are, in other words, a number of reasons why states or independent ulama may see advantages in expanding religious authority to women within certain confines. These confines are, however, quite substantive. At present, looking at recent developments, it is clear that women still have a long way to go to reach positions of religious authority on par with those of men. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. So our last panelist is Amel. Okay. So Amel is currently based in Grenoble. She's been a research fellow at several institutions, including Brookings Doha Center and Carnegie Middle East Center, where she studied the Maghreb, democratization in the Arab world, Euro-Arab, US-Arab relations, and Islam in Europe. She is a regular consultant for various UN agencies and the European Commission. Her book, Whatever Happened to the Islamists, was nominated for the Foreign Policy 2012 Best Books on the Middle East Award.
Thank you, Kadir, for your invitation. Thank you for also for this gender-balanced panel and last speaker of the last panel. So please stick with me. I will try to be brief as well. I have worked on Islamist parties for the past 15 years, and you know that since the revolution or the so-called Arab Spring, I mean, this has been the most commented issues, but I would say the most also misunderstood, because I will explain why, but there are Islamism everywhere, but a very, very poor analysis or very low level of comprehension of how Islamists themselves have evolved during these past 7 years, and focusing on the Maghreb, which are Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, which are the countries I'm working on. I will try to explain what has changed so far these past 7 years, not only for the Islamist parties, but also for political Islam itself. So since these are 3 countries and 7 years, I will focus, of course, on the commonalities. That doesn't mean that there are no differences, but of course, I will try to find a common path to understand this evolution. I will focus on 2 main categories. As I say, the legalized Islamist parties. So, for example, in Morocco, this is the PJD. In Algeria, that will be the Hamas. In Tunisia, that will be a Nahda. And I will focus on a second category, which are called non-programmatic forms of political Islam, namely Salafism, and also a kind of new Islamist civil society that is reorganizing after the Arab Spring. A bit of context first. If you look at what have been the main narratives on Islamist parties and political Islam after the Arab Spring, Islamists have been caught between 2 narratives, I would say. In media and public opinion, it was either, that's great, Islamist parties have been elected or they are now associated, and between brackets, I will talk here about cases of revolution, such as Tunisia, but also of neo-authoritarianism, such as Algeria and Morocco. So the first narrative was either, well, that's great, Islamist parties have been elected, they are now in power, so it means that we are achieving some level of democracy or democratization of the country, or on the contrary, in public opinion and media, it was, oh, that's terrible, I mean, democracy is in danger, these guys will suppress all our basic rights now that they are in power, and so on. But academia was also called academics were also caught between 2 kinds of narratives, and they were mainly focusing on 2 dynamics: either exclusion, Islamist parties and Islamist actors who have not won the elections and will maybe excluded and then radicalized and then be the lead for a new revolution, or on the other hand, the Islamist parties who have won the elections and who will be integrated, and then we will become moderate and etc. and being normalized and so on. None of that has actually happened yet. And my main argument here is that focusing only on the main dynamics of electoral inclusions or electoral failure of or authoritarian exclusion is actually making. I mean, it makes us missing the point of what really happened in neo-authoritarian context or post-revolutionary context, there are important challenges in such context that I will mention that we have to take into account in order to understand how political Islam transforms. The first one, or the first challenge, is actually in such context. It's about the political field. I mean, how the transformed political field in a post-revolutionary situation, what kind of impact it has on Islamist parties. Well, there's a huge taboo in these countries and also elsewhere. By the way, what I'm saying here is also can also be relevant to non-Islamist political parties and even Islamist parties elsewhere, such as in Egypt and so on. So there's a very important taboo, which is the conquest of the state. In Algeria, for example, but also in Morocco and even now in Tunisia, it's a real taboo to say that, or to show that you're doing politics in order to conquer the state. I mean, you may do politics in order to be there and be present and negotiate and compromise and so on and have an agenda that you self-limit. But conquering the state by violent or non-violent means, it's a real taboo, and they have to adapt to that. And in such contexts, I mean, how do you express conflict? How do you face ruling elite? How do you talk about the necessity to change power structures? There's also a second challenge, which is about the party. What happened to the structure of the party? What kind of position can the Islamist parties be after having either won or being excluded? I mean, are they still legitimate to talk about the opposition to an authoritarian state? Have they been able to invent new democratic molds? Have they been able to reinforce political structures and so on? And finally, the ideology. I mean, we are witnessing in the region and beyond the Maghreb a decline of identity politics and a fatigue with oppositional politics. So that's also important to get that in mind, to understand how it is impacting the mobilization of political Islam as a political resource. So I will talk about the way Islamist parties adapt to that, and I would like to offer a new methodological approach instead of focusing only on authoritarian resilience and how actually authoritarian states limit Islamist parties. I would like to focus on how Islamist parties adapt and transform themselves, and also how they have a high complexity, that the agency is highly complex as political actors in such context. So. First, to talk about the limits of the participatory strategies of legalized Islamist parties in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia for these past 7 years, there have been also several challenges and several transformations. Among the main important ones, in my opinion, there was the issue of the revolution. What could they do with the revolution? They were... After the revolution, they all inscribed their rhetorics within the revolutionary framework, saying that social justice is primarily also about Islam, and they were the ones to talk about social justice. But they fundamentally did not take revolution beyond the symbol. I mean, I'm often saying as a joke that they took the revolution without the revolutionaries. They didn't, for example, embrace the political creativity that was born from the revolutionary mobilizations that were about decentralization, and the renewing of political representativeness, and so on. So they didn't embrace the post-revolutionary political creativity that emerged, and only focus on a vague acceptation or legitimation of political Islam, of the revolutions, excuse me, as a way to legitimate themselves as political actors. A second important point is about the pseudo-electoral process they have been in. I'm talking about pseudo-electoral process because you know that these electoral processes are really mainly controlled or highly controlled from the top, from the top. So it's difficult to talk about free electoral victories in these cases, but still they had to. Okay, they won the elections, I mean, at a local level, legislative or even municipal, but they had to decide how they will tackle the challenge of abstention, which is such an important challenge in the region. and the political apathy of people. I mean, Islamist parties have been the most successful structures in mobilizing their their followers, but they haven't been thinking about how to reintegrate their followers or their grassroots or people who simply voted for them as long-term political agents. And this is an important issue. They have not been able also to renew power structures. I mean, how the way they deal with the way they dealt with old elite shows us that we may have seen the end of a system of a dictatorial system, but not the end of a system of domination over the institutions. So all the elites still dominate the institutions, and they have not challenged also the old regime's modes of governance. They have been rather busy to ensure the primacy of their party, reinforcing paternalistic figures such as Ranouchi, for example, and not really thinking about how to renew politics away from a paternalistic way to mobilize political resources. As a consequence, the consequence of these limits, the limits of these participatory strategies that the legalized Islamist parties have chosen, I have seen after the revolution emerging, as I said in the introduction, non-programmatic forms of political Islam. Why I'm calling that non-programmatic forms, of political Islam is that actually they first do not show a prime interest for the state and for the reform of the state. They are not interested in elections, and they are not interested in having a clear programmatic agenda that they will use in order to convince people and followers. Really, the emergence of these forms of political Islam that are not more interested in replacing the regime, because it's not because they are not interested in such, but because it's so difficult and it's so costly to try to replace the regime and the old elite, have done three things. They have first been able to manage the taboo of conquering the state that I was mentioning in the introduction by not being interested in state politics or formal party politics at all. Second, they have been able to manage the abstention that and the political apathy I was mentioning among people by actually not considering strategies of mass mobilization. They are not interested in having a million people beyond them in order to carry their project or to make their message heard. And they have been also able to lessen political barriers. Islamist parties, whatever we can say, I mean, are very elitic parties. I mean, they are very elitist parties. You have to go through such an important and tough process of adaptation and Islamic education, and it's very hierarchical and so on. These movements, they actually offer very adaptable forms of daily political Islams that are trying to answer the daily political needs or the daily needs of basic needs of people, such as, and I will explain how, and they are basically not talking a lot about Mathuret or I don't know, ideological things that Islamist parties are so interested in. Among these two groups, maybe among these forms of non-programmatic political Islam, the challenge or the emergence of Salafi lobbies, or localized forms of Salafism. These are Salafi actors, young Salafi actors, that actually, it's really interesting to see that with the failure or the limits of participatory strategies that I was mentioning among Islamist parties, these Salafi actors have been able to go beyond the binary concept of being Hizbi or anti-Hizbi. You know that Salafi were withdrawing from politics because they are reluctant to be involved in a political party, but with this political Islam being everywhere, it has been a niche for them to be able to talk about Islam in a more free, in the streets, to protest, and also to feel for non-functioning state institutions at the local level, and to gain local credibility. Actually, their discourses are mainly local. In Algeria, for example, they are no more calling for an Islamic State, but much more to people to boycott New Year's Eve because it's un-Islamic, for example. They are also organizing a march against the cartoons of Charlie Hebdo, I mean, this kind of thing. A second category of, I think it's an important category of renewed form of political Islam, are all these young people who were part of Islamist parties and who have been deceived by the compromises and the backdoors negotiations that have excluded them of the leaders of their parties, and who are now not willing to pay the price of being a member of a party without getting any rewards, and who are launching initiatives such as for example, or joining initiatives in civil society among unemployed young people, launching think tanks with an Islamic stance, but absolutely not anymore in the framework of their first party. And I'm not talking about a return to the Haraka, you know, this very famous distinction between the Hizb and the Haraka, between the party and the movement. It's a reassessment of the informal political opportunities that the failure of the Islamist parties have made emerge. As a conclusion, I would say that political transitions, revolutions, whatever you want, have been a really strong impact on Islamist parties. So first, yes, they have been integrated at last, but this is not the revolution that they kept on promising for years that have happened. They have been a bit sidelined by, as I said, the political creativity that emerged from this revolution or this reform process. They also have not been able to go beyond short-term strategies of negotiating their place with the old regime elite. And doing so, they have actually weakened the institutions, the national institutions they sought to be part of, and that's a very concerning issue for the future of political pluralism in the region. Second, they have compromised, they have been able to impose themselves on the political scene, but are they political influencers? I mean, their agenda, their program on Islamic social justice, on economic redistribution, have they been able to influence the political process on these specific points? I don't believe so. And as a final line, I would say that this overview of how the current use of political Islam in the Maghreb has been depoliticized and has been much more linked to informal levels of negotiation shows that consensus, even if they may be reached in transitional or post-revolutionary period, produce unstable forms of political Islam, but do not eradicate them. So that's one point. And the second point is that it does not eradicate them, but it's also sidelines official party politics and formal politics, and this predominancy of informal negotiation is also very costly, I believe, to Islamist parties and other forms of political Islam, and may create more subsequent hostile and volatile mobilizations, such as unframed protests, as we can see it in the 3 countries, that Islamists won't be able to control anymore. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ahmed. So we'll have some questions, and that's going to be the end of our first day. Abdussalam.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Abdussalam Maghrawi at Duke University. So I have a question actually to each one of the panelists, if you don't mind. Nathan, what is really the significance of the transfer of the institution of Al-Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy Anil Munkar from the religious sphere to the political sphere? Is that a compromise of the religious authorities, or what does it really tell us? It seems to me that it could make the state even more autocratic in the sense of, controlling or dominating also the religious spheres. For Miriam, do you have any kind of insight on the religious courts? Are there like women going there? Because there are a lot of very sensitive issues in the religious courts about divorce, especially and inheritance. It's a big debate in Morocco about whether what to do with the question of inheritance, and if you have any insights on that, especially the difference between Sunni and Shia, Iran and Morocco or Turkey. And Amal, my question is that you mentioned that the Islamists in the Maghreb or in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia have pretty much given up on the political, power. That do you see a parallel trend that the da'wah is increasing instead? I mean, if they say, well, there are institution guards against us, there's the military, there's the international community, we're never going to be able to really come and govern. Are they going back to do a lot of the work? I mean, I see that in Morocco in a way with PJD for some time, that when they came to power, well, they realized we are in government, we really can't really do much. But on the other hand, they really try to focus on a lot of the religion in the public realm. Thank you.
You guys want to answer?
Let me answer briefly. Yes, I think that's exactly what it does. It essentially subordinates the body, the organization, the committee, whatever you want to call it, diminishes its authority. Even its authority, essentially, up until fairly recently, it's pursued its own interpretations of Islamic law or consulted whom it wanted to, so it would diminish its authority there. I think it also, there might be an interesting other effect, although this is speculative on my part, it would have a lot to do with recruitment. Essentially, this will be simply a much less attractive organization to join, that they've basically gone out to specific sectors of Saudi society and say, you're kind of known for your piety and your observance, and suddenly you're basically lower level powerless bureaucrats. And so I suspect what it will do will be to make the organization simply much less attractive for those people to join.
Yeah, thank you. On the question on courts, so both the Sunni and the Shia schools of law, and this is of course pre-modern legal opinion, say that women cannot function as judges, and the justifications are often focused on the fact that a woman cannot exert authority in a public space over a man, and then there are others also that women would lack sufficient aql in order to function as a judge. But of course, there are also minority opinions in each of these schools that actually argue the opposite. And contemporary intellectuals in Iran, for example, have built on these minority opinions, and in order to argue that, well, sometimes they're inconsistent. If you allow a woman to be a mufti in all matters, then she cannot have insufficient aql to be a judge. Then only the justification that she cannot exert authority in a public space over a man, that should count. And then maybe we can rethink it in contemporary times. So I mean, these are just sort of discursive tools in order to challenge predominant opinions that justify the exclusion of women from courts that either exclusively or overwhelmingly apply Islamic law. But nevertheless, there are, so apart from, these are just Sharia courts, apart from the judges in Ramallah and the one in Israel that I mentioned, actually Sudan and Indonesia already since the 1960s have appointed women in courts that exclusively apply religious law. That's very interesting. And Malaysia then in the 2000s, sort of being informed by the Indonesian model that had already now been going on for 30 years, also started to appoint women in Sharia courts, although they're actually not equal to the male judges in Malaysia, but in Indonesia they are. So there are some changes. It doesn't seem to me. It doesn't seem to be a difference between Shia and Sunni fiqh. It's more a question of social practices. And interestingly enough, in Indonesia, it was actually an accident because they started to open the Sharia court faculties, and they forgot to exclude admission, to close admission for women. And so women started to go to the Sharia faculties just as they went to study other aspects of Islam. Hadith sciences were never closed to women, but they forgot to close admission to women for hudud and other aspects of law. And so women then also applied for judgeships, and they got it because no bureaucrat was informed that, oh, women should actually not be a judge in a court. And today it's widely accepted. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Abdeslam. Actually, I won't say that they are going back to dawah, because it's not such an extraordinary thing to be an Islamist now in the Maghreb or even in the Arab world. That's not such an extraordinary identity in in context where societies are actually reaching a consensus that they are Islamically conservative society, even among the young. If we take some of the topics such as asking for the hijab in public institutions, or asking for the call of the prayer, the call to prayer on TV, I mean, all the things that seemed so revolutionary 20 years ago are not belonging solely to Islamists now in the society. So there has been a demonopolization of Islamist teams, if I can put it that way, and a diffusion of these teams among civil society. So what will they bring in terms of dawah, especially towards young people? But there's something they are trying to do, and also indeed to instigate some dawah in it. It's about reconnecting to, or connecting in a parasitic way to social protest movements. I've seen that very much so in the 3 countries. In order to regain some oppositional legitimacy, they are, especially after having been excluded or limited by the ruling elite in official politics, they are trying to connect with young unemployed people demands, or social justice, and all these kind of social movements.
Yes.
Catherine Skanke-Iglesias. I'm a demographer, and I'm interested in the concept of social mobility. And here in the Arab world, do you look at religion only as kind of an ascribed characteristic, or do people in times, are they able to shift from one religion to another? And in the case of some of the states, would they have access to secular courts or versus religious courts? Because in the US, you look at religion as something, even in the same family, people can convert easily from one religion to the other. But of course, we have secular courts and secular educational systems. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about, do people change religion because they're unhappy so they could go to another religion that often, and what is the social mobility aspect or opportunities I want to ask about?
I'll address it sort of as a legal issue. I mean, religion in most of these societies is a legal category, right? Because it determines your personal status. So, yes, people switch religions, and it becomes legally difficult, or you do it for all kinds of reasons. You might do it. I mean, why are there Egyptian Protestants? It's probably because somebody's grandfather wanted a divorce once and wanted to be governed by Protestant rather than by Coptic law. So yes, it happens, but it's legally and politically fraught in ways that it wouldn't be if religion is simply a matter of personal faith. Religion is a matter of sort of legal and social status.
No. You said it.
Other questions?
I actually have a question to Nathan, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
And it's a little bit for the whole part of the project, because of course the question, what does it have to do with pluralism, is pertinent to ask, how much do you think the state should be involved in regulating religion, right? Because you have 2 examples here of where the state, in one case, the state took a hands-off approach, but was really sort of taken over by religious authorities in ways that stifled social development and development in all sorts of ways. I think one can say that. And in another case, you have Egypt that highly regulates religion, but also restricts pluralism and restricts free discourse about legal questions and dogmatic questions and theological questions. And I don't think one can just sort of take the easy way out and say, well, the state should just stay aloof of all of these normative issues and not get involved with religion at all, because that can mean that you allow society to cultivate very, very exclusionary dogmatics that are justified with reference to religion. So, what really should one take away from that? Is it a matter of how much regulation or what kind of things are being regulated? Is it more important to regulate religious education, but maybe the state shouldn't get involved with religious law at all and just allow people to privately follow religious law if they like to, but let the law, the state law, be blind to issues of religious identity? Or what kind of...
Those are fantastic questions, and I don't have a fantastic answer because there's a lot of shoulds, right? What I would say is, I mean, when I look at the situation that I described, I'm looking at two very different kinds of places. What they share in common is, in the sense that the state building and religion are very much married to each other, and in the sense that institutionally, I think, limits an awful lot of options or makes some options sort of outside the realm of what looks politically practicable in the short term. What I would say is that there is a great trade-off that I think regimes within the region are grappling with right now, is that it's not that much of a problem for them to exert greater control over religious structures because, as I say, religion is so hardwired into the state apparatus. But more that they do so, the more they make it, in essence, religion very often the sort of the mobilizing force for opposition as well. And they can often discredit some of the religious structures to the extent that they manipulate them, often for short-term policy objectives. So other than observing that there's that trade-off, I don't have any other answers to all the should questions.
Thank you.
Okay. This concludes our program for today. Tomorrow we start at 9 with breakfast. 9:30, Dr. Tariq Mitri will have his remarks. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you tomorrow.